Brilliant effort. So I have been joking with some friends this week that I was under house arrest. It wasn't really that, it was a stay-at-home order. But I did joke it was a house arrest. And there is someone in the Bible who was under house arrest legitimately. And that someone was Paul, sometimes called the Apostle Paul. And Paul wrote a fair bit of the New Testament. And some of it was written while he was under house arrest in Rome, awaiting trial. He was there for 2 years under house arrest. And one of the letters that he wrote was to a church in a city, or it was a large town really rather than a city, called Colossae, that had many different faiths and philosophies represented amongst its people. Let me share a story that will help set the scene. I attended a multi-faith meeting a few weeks ago held at the Jewish synagogue in the city. And I'd like to make a point here that it was freezing cold. And this was built in 1845. And back then, at least now you could plug some heater in and heat the place up, which they didn't do anyway for some reason, but you could if you wanted to heat it. But back in the day, 1845, they didn't have any kind of heating. So these guys were tough back there. But there were maybe 25 or 30 people there at the synagogue, and they represented many different religions and Christian denominations. It was a picture of diversity and unity, and the meeting was about safety for faith communities, because some faith communities are the target of vandalism and sometimes much worse than that. And the police were there to talk to the crowd to help everyone learn how to keep their faith communities safe. Now, if an alien had landed and walked in there and asked, "Who is the God here on planet Earth?" what kind of answer would the alien have received? If there are, say, 20 different faiths and denominations present at the meeting, are they all incompatible with each other? Well, no. There might be a case that this faith is here and this faith over here might not be incompatible. Their beliefs might not be the same, but they might not be incompatible. But let me be very clear today that if Christianity is true, then none of the others can be true. Philosophies such as all roads lead to Rome and each to their own are nonsensical, illogical, and inane. All roads lead to Rome sounds nice. It sounds fair, it sounds lovely, it sounds inclusive. But look where inclusivity is getting us anyway. We now have biological males competing at the Olympics as females. And more than that, these athletes prevent biological females the opportunity to compete legitimately by taking a spot in the team. Now, I don't think you need a biology degree to know that males and females are biologically different. But just in case you do, I have one. And males and females are biologically different. Including everyone is not always a good thing. But sorry, I digress. If Christianity is true, then the others can't be true. Christianity is incompatible with Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism and Brahma Kumaris. Now, I have friends and colleagues in my work who are Muslim and Hindu and Brahma Kumaris, and I really enjoy their company. But what I believe as a Christian is incompatible with what they each believe in their own faith. And they would agree with me. And just in case some of this is online and some of those people are watching and listening, if you want to have a coffee with me and discuss this, I'd love to do that. We choose to work together to serve our community, but what we believe about God and religion is very different to each other. If anyone ever says to you that when it comes to religion, all roads lead to Rome, you know they are ignorant of Christian truths. They don't understand. They might have an abundance of friends because they accept all and offend none, but what they say cannot be true. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. A doctor called Luke wrote, salvation exists in no one else except Jesus. There is no other name given under heaven by which people can be saved. And how do we have these statements from people who lived about 2,000 years ago? They're in the Bible. But now we're going to turn our attention to the church in Colossae that Paul wrote a letter to from house arrest. The church was in a town with many faiths and philosophies, and at the time that Paul wrote the letter, the Bible didn't exist. In fact, the letter that Paul wrote to that church ended up becoming part of the Bible that we have today. So the church in Colossae didn't have a Bible or any other text to refer to. They didn't have writings to guide their journey in this new faith of Christianity. So not surprisingly, some of the ideas from the other faiths in the town were being incorporated into the beliefs and practices of the local church. How were they to know? They didn't have a blueprint as to how it was supposed to look. They didn't have a Bible. And isn't it interesting how the word Bible is now used to describe the ultimate guide to a particular thing or place or activity? Someone writes a book about flower arranging, and it's so good it becomes known as the Bible for flower arranging. Who would buy that book? Not a single one. Someone writes a book about the economic policies in Western democracies. And it's so good that it's often referred to as the Bible for economic policies in Western democracies. Who would buy that book?
Anthony.
Anthony would. Where's my daughter? She'd buy that book. You didn't put your hand up. You would. Now, I actually wrote a book late last century.
I'd buy that book.
Thank you. Correct answer. I wrote a book about Australian seafood. And at the time, the British TV chef Rick Stein wrote a review of the book, and he called it the Bible of Australian seafood. Now, if a book is called the Bible of something, it's the ultimate comprehensive guide. So that begs the question, what's the Bible for? Well, the Bible is the ultimate comprehensive guide to life. The Bible is the Bible for how God and humans connect together. The Bible is the Bible for how we should live and love and make the world a better place for the ultimate glory of Jesus Christ. But the church in Colossae didn't have a Bible because it wasn't written yet. So Paul wrote a letter to them because he heard from a guy called Epaphras. Now, Epaphras was probably the one who started the church in Colossae in the first place. He heard from Epaphras that weird and wonderful ideas were infiltrating the church and leading it astray. In the melting pot of faiths and philosophies, Paul wanted to spell it out clearly and plainly to the church in Colossae that Jesus is enough. You don't need to add anything or anyone else over and above Jesus Christ. One of the thoughts circulating at the time was that salvation could be attained through enlightenment, making knowledge itself the goal for many people. So Paul wrote to direct the Christians there to seek knowledge about Jesus. God was to be the focus of their search or quest for knowledge. Another thought circulating around in those times was that angels were acting as intermediaries between God and people, meaning there was no connection to God himself for the people with that thought. People with this belief had a false humility that made them consider themselves unworthy to approach God's presence, and they therefore ended up worshipping these other intermediaries as their gateway to God. Paul wrote to the Colossian church to teach them that Jesus himself was enough. They didn't need another go-between to approach God. Another aspect of life in the Christian church in Colossae at this time was that there were Jews who accepted Jesus as Messiah, but thought that the Jewish practices and rules still needed to be followed. Not just by them, but by Gentiles or non-Jews who had become believers in the church. Now the city was mainly one of non-Jews or Gentiles. So most of the people in the church would not have a Jewish upbringing. But there were some Jews there who were saying yes to Jesus, but also saying that the Jewish ceremonies and rules had to be practiced and followed, not just by them as Jews, but by everyone in the church. So Epaphras visited Paul when he was under house arrest in Rome and told Paul that some of the false teaching was weaving its way into the church. Some of these mystic thoughts about knowledge and angels, and some of the suggested requirements around following Jewish rules. So Paul became concerned about the church and wrote them a letter to help keep the Colossians on track. He realised that the church hadn't rejected Jesus, but some people had ended up accepting Christ as just one of another number of gods in their life. So if I'm Paul, and you are the Colossian church, what do I want to write to get you back on track? What's the most important thing to remind you of? If you now believe that you need to follow certain Jewish laws in order to be a Christian, or that gaining knowledge into your life will lead you to salvation, then I need to tell you about what Jesus has done for you. And what practical things should I tell you about what you should do and what you shouldn't do in order to live a life worthy of God's calling? If you think you can just add Jesus as another God to the number of gods you already have, then you don't really understand what Jesus has done for you or who he is. If you think you need to follow certain rules and regulations that the Jewish people observe and are trying to enforce on you, then you don't really understand who Jesus is or what he's done for you. So we'll take a look in a moment at how Paul addressed these issues in his letter to the Colossian church. But before we do, we need to acknowledge that there are some similar issues for us today. There are all sorts of philosophies circulating in our city, in our society. Some pretty weird stuff, to be honest, that doesn't conform to the truth of Jesus. And as believers in Jesus, we need to ensure that we don't add untruths into our belief system. As Christians, we don't need to add someone else's anti-God guess about the meaning of life, or someone else's anti-Christ conjecture about what happens when you die. We would be unwise to incorporate into our thinking a philosophy that causes friction with our faith in Jesus. We live in a multicultural, multi-faith society, and it's perhaps therefore not surprising that we can collect and assimilate non-Christian worldviews into our thinking without even realising it. It probably happens to us all at some time. Now, if you think you are immune here, here's some thinking time to consider how you are going with materialism. Materialism is the tendency to consider material possessions and our physical comfort to be more important than spiritual values. You need some more thinking time for that one. And incidentally, just as an aside, there are studies that show a causal relationship between self-esteem and materialism. Low self-esteem increases materialism and vice versa. So we need to be on guard. We need to know Jesus, and we need to know our Bible. We need to make sure of what we believe and why we believe it. So while Paul wrote this letter to a church in a town in an area that's now in modern-day Turkey, it's strangely relevant to us in Tasmania about 2,000 years later. So I'm going to unpack this message of Colossians over a couple of sermons. So this is part one, and I'll finish it off next time I preach. So today, I'm going to concentrate on three truths that Paul writes to the church. And next time I will cover how Paul explains what the reader's response should be to these truths and how he instructs them to express Jesus better through their lives. Now I've given a long introduction to get to this point. So quickly, here are the three key messages from Paul to the church in Colossae. Number one, Jesus is all, or Jesus is enough. You don't need to add anything else. He is the complete package. Listen to what Paul writes to the Colossian church with respect to Jesus. He, Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created. Jane started her prayer this morning with those very words. All things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things. And in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. In those few verses are about 100 sermons. There is so much in there. By Jesus, all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Stop and think about that for a moment. By Jesus, or in some translations, in Jesus, all things were created. And it goes on to say, all things were created through him and for him. And then it says, he is before all things, and in him all things are held together. Now this is the time when I remind you that not all religious faiths are the same. There are all sorts of philosophies and faiths, but all these roads don't lead to the same place. It's a fairly common belief in our society that people can believe what they want as long as it doesn't adversely affect other people. And I'm fairly sure that most Australians really have little understanding of the differences between the major religions, and that looking from the outside, they take and each to their own attitude. But the major religions, the ones you list, if I ask you to list 4 or 5 religions, have foundational beliefs that are in conflict with each other. Do I need to read those scriptures again to reinforce their point? And here in the writings of Paul to the church in Colossae, we have one such belief. Jesus created everything and he existed before the work of creation began. If these are true, then all the other philosophies about who created and how this who created are false. Paul is not mincing his words to the Colossian church. Jesus is the creator. And if you have some other beliefs, some other faiths about how you got to be here, then you need to let them go. If Jesus created all things, there is no room to add another potential deity or God into your faith story. When it comes to the church, these verses go on to say that Jesus is the head of the church, and in Jesus all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And he is there to reconcile or to bring back together everyone and everything to himself. And he makes all that possible, that reconciliation and that peace, by his shed blood on his cross. The gospel message right there. And because of all that, Jesus can present you holy and blameless before God. So the bottom line of Paul's message here was, you don't need anyone else. Jesus is enough. The second truth that Paul writes to the Colossians is that knowing Jesus is what will bring positive outcomes in your world. Knowing Jesus brings positive outcomes. Knowledge itself was not the goal, but the important truth here was to focus the quest for knowledge on the person of Jesus. This is what Paul writes in chapter 1, right up the front of his letter to this church. And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will, in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, That little bit there is so good, I'm going to read it again. And so from the day we heard, we've not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of what? The knowledge of His will, in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. What's the outcome? So as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to Him. Yep. And I bet there's some Christians here this morning who want to live a life worthy of the calling that God has placed upon them, and a life that is pleasing to Him. How do you do it? Get filled with the knowledge of His will. Not just any knowledge, but the knowledge of His will. Moving on. Bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. Knowledge of what? Knowledge of God. Being strengthened with all power according to His glorious might for all endurance and patience with joy. Giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in the light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of His beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. The gospel story again. What awesome and encouraging words. As we are filled with the knowledge about God, we walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, bearing fruit in every good work. And in doing that, we increase even more in the knowledge of God. We are strengthened with all power for endurance and patience with joy. We are transferred from darkness to light. Another scripture in the Bible, 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10 says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for His own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of Him who called you out of darkness into His wonderful, marvellous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." Transferred from darkness into His marvellous light. And all this is the result of knowing Jesus Christ. Note that these verses don't say, know Christ, and add in a bit of meditation with some mystic mantra. They don't say, know Christ, and also add in some practices of other religions, where you have to perform certain rituals a few times a day, or abstain from certain foods. These verses don't say, know Christ, but keep your options open in case you get a better offer later. You won't get a better offer than the offer from Jesus Christ. Yep. But it's not too hard to find Christians who are perhaps best described as wishy-washy, because they don't seem to be convinced that Jesus is God and that Jesus is all you need. There are some people of faith who have a Jesus and other stuff mentality rather than a Jesus alone faith. Just before we move on to the third truth from Colossians, you may have noticed that the word all is repeated over and over again in the verses from Colossians that we've read so far. Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. By Him all things were created. All things were created through Him. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything or all things He might be preeminent. In Him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through Him to reconcile to Himself all things. We have not ceased to pray that you may be filled with the knowledge of His will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding, being strengthened with all power according to His glorious might for all endurance and patience with joy. All those verses are just from the few I've read so far from Colossians. Paul is driving home the point that Jesus is all. Jesus is enough. We don't need to add anything else or anyone else into our faith story. In chapter 2, Paul explains he is saying all this about the supremacy of Jesus because he's concerned that the folk in the church in Colossae might be deluded by people with plausible sounding arguments. And that's a risk. There are plenty of plausible sounding arguments. In verse 8 of chapter 2, Paul says he wants to rejoice in seeing the firmness of their faith in Christ. He is concerned that the Christians don't get taken captive by philosophy and empty deceit that's according to human tradition or demonic spirits of the world. This brings us to the third key message from Paul to the church in Colossae. And the message is their future in this life and beyond to the afterlife is secure. From Colossians 2 and 3. Therefore, as you received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, just as you were taught, abounding in thanksgiving. See to it that no one takes you captive by philosophy and empty deceit, according to human tradition, according to the elemental spirits of the world, and not according to Christ. If then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. Did someone say materialism? For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Paul is saying, keep walking with Jesus and your future is secure. Jesus is completely sufficient for salvation and sanctification. The elemental spirits mentioned here are linked later in this book of Colossians with human rituals and practices, so perhaps they refer to the demonic spirits that control certain humanistic thought. But whatever the phrase means, there is strong encouragement from Paul that Jesus has brought the Colossians out of darkness and that they should do all they can to stay on track with him. So Paul introduces these truths. He's concerned about the church. He's concerned about these different faiths and philosophies influencing their thinking. So he writes them a letter and teaches them that Jesus is all, or Jesus is enough. You don't need anybody else. He teaches them and shows them that knowing Jesus brings positive outcomes. And he teaches them that their future is secure. He hammers home this point about Jesus being enough. And the fact that we need to be really careful about the thoughts and the philosophies and the faiths and the ideas that come our way and risk taking us off course. So as the musos come, please, have a think about these truths with respect to your life. Jesus is enough, or Jesus is all. Knowing Jesus brings positive outcomes. And your future is secure. In a moment we're going to sing the song we sang last. It's called No One But You. And is that what it's called? Well, I can guess on it. But it's got that phrase in there, no one but you. And we're going to sing it in 2 or 3 minutes' time. I want to give you a little bit of time just to think about your own journey, your own faith journey, your own faith story. And make a choice today to declare, as we sing this song together, to Jesus, no one but you. And you might be in a situation where you could identify some things that have come into your life in the last few days or weeks or months or even years that have somehow, in that area of your life, dethroned Jesus. And rather than being the king of everything in your life, he's the king perhaps of some things, but not everything. So this is an opportunity to say yes to Jesus all over again. And our theme this year at Grace is all about getting better at expressing Jesus in our life and through our life. And the second part of the message, next time I preach, is all the practical advice that Paul gives to this church in Colossae about how to do that. What should you do, what shouldn't you do, in order to better express Jesus in your community, in your society. But these are the foundational truths which are mostly at the front end of this letter, and he goes on later to talk about the practical things. So we have an opportunity today to respond to these truths that Paul wrote to the church in Colossae. We have an opportunity to say yes to Jesus all over again. To sing, to lift our arms and our hands in worship and to declare no one but you. And I realise for some people that might be a difficult thing to do today because of where you're at in your life. Maybe for some people it's really easy. Maybe you've already done that in your own time this morning. So it's just a continuation of your day of worship. But I recognise that for some people it might be a difficult choice. You might be deciding today to say no to some part of your life which you're perhaps even quite enjoying, but you realise it's not glorifying to God. So I recognise it's a somber time, in a sense, for some people to make that choice. But Jesus Christ is worthy. He is all. He is everything. He is enough. And the most positive outcomes that can come in your life will come if you are following after Jesus with Him as number one. And as you do that, your future is secure. Your future on this earth and your future in the afterlife. Your future is secure in Him. So take a moment to consider your life. You might like to stand with me because we are about to sing